So I'd like to introduce Father Hugh Gillespie, who's going to be preaching for our conference tonight and tomorrow and on Sunday.
My first contact with the Legion of Mary was when the Legion of Mary came looking for me. And that was a number of years ago when I received a call from the other side of the country inviting me to come and give a retreat to the gathered legionaries of the Houston Senatus of the Legion on devotion to Our Lady. And it was in the context of that retreat that, as I was speaking with the legionaries and the officers of the Senatus, with some questions just even in terms of, what do you really need me to do with you and for you during this retreat? Because there are many ways of framing devotion to Mary, but the Legion of Mary undoubtedly has its own. That I began to look at, explore, and study the Legion system. One of the things that caught my attention in my first engagement with the handbook and my first discussions with longtime legionaries was something that we don't hear discussed frequently. And it's the simple fact that so much of the system rises or falls on the quality of the spiritual direction it's receiving. The handbook has a number of things to say about the spiritual director, but they're spread out over the book. And yet, one of the most strident points of insistence in the handbook is the fundamental importance of the spiritual director. Each Praesidium should have a spiritual director. Each Curia should have a spiritual director. Each Comitium, the Senatus, the Concilium. There is spiritual direction on all levels. And that director is not merely chosen or selected by the Legion, but is appointed by somebody outside of the Legion. The pastor or his delegate. The bishop appointing. And one of then the additional things that one realizes very quickly is that there is an assumption, which is a weakness, in the handbook as it discusses the spiritual director. The handbook assumes that all clergy have infused knowledge of and interest in the Legion of Mary, including bishops. And as we know, that is not the case. And so one of the frustrating elements of the Legion system is the lack of discussion on how does one even begin to be a spiritual director? Where does one start? What are the key elements? And where does the director fit within the system? So we'll take some time today unpacking some of these ideas. But in saying that, one of the things we have to recognize is when we engage the handbook, there is an art to reading the handbook well. It is not primarily a rule book. And when we treat it that way, we are going to misread it. In a sense, we're going to lose ourselves in its many details and miss the fundamental point of what the process is. Secondly, the handbook speaks in a very particular kind of language. And we see this on two levels. One, the biblical and Marian language of the handbook is not the language of our present day. It is older, traditional language that can seem mysterious to many of our Legion members and, frankly, to some of our clergy. And it is important to recognize that. In fact, on a biblical note, the fundamental importance of Genesis 3:15, the woman crushing the head of the serpent. And if we think about that, that's also a violent image. It's a militant image. And it runs through the statements of the handbook about the Legion and its mission all the way. And so there is a need to just become familiar with this older way of speaking about Our Lady. Secondly, however, the handbook, by its very nature, is going to use very strong and at times exalted language of the Legion, its mission, its purpose. And that makes perfect sense because one needs to articulate a clear and a bold vision that people can buy into. The problem, however, is when we read certain statements about the greatness of the work and the importance of the struggle and the need for heroism, and we turn around and we look at the present moment in which we're living. And what do we find? We've all gotten older. We're tired. Folks have stopped coming to church. We have a hard time getting officers, and the Legion is so big and only a handful of us clergy are doing direction. And the contrast between that humble and fragile reality in which we often find ourselves and the bold and vigorous language of the handbook can not just be jarring as we read it, but if we're not careful, it can even be a bit disheartening. We'll never get it right. Who's going to do this? And so I begin with a text then that's not the handbook. The Company of Mary, the little community of missionaries founded by St. Louis Marie de Montfort, to which I belong, has a curious foundation. All his life, Father de Montfort prayed for a community to continue his work and with whom he could work while he was alive. And when he died, he had a handful of brothers and a couple priests who were sort of maybe almost thinking of continuing the mission. And one would look at that and say, oh, what a bitter disappointment, and yet he dies a happy man, secure that this is going to happen. And he left behind a set of 3 brief works by which he sought to establish the spirit and the work of this foundation. And the first is a prayer. We call it the burning prayer. And it's this great cry of his heart and his spirit to heaven. And he names the realities that threaten the church. He names the situation, but he also then begins articulating the missionary boldness, the heroism of character, the vigor of spirit that he desires to see in priests formed and working under the banner and protection of Our Lady to go forth with boldness to renew a church in desperate need of being renewed. It's an incredibly powerful and vigorous vision. And if one isn't careful, one gets swept up in its boldness without noting the other documents. The middle document is simply the rule, the framework within which this work will be done. But then the third document is a letter to the men of this company that doesn't yet exist. And it's the letter that completes the picture, and it names the reality a bit differently. He says, you are few, and they are so many. You are weak, and they are so very strong. You are poor, and they are so rich. You have no status, no influence, no importance, and they have the backing of everyone that matters. What a different picture. And he says, fear not. And it's a beautiful statement of don't deny your fragility and don't deny your limit. But recognize that that boldness of vision will express, assert, and articulate itself in and through this fragile reality that you are. When we speak about the Legion in the present day and the state of the church in the present day, those are wise words. We can't first become someone different. We begin where we are, with a certain fragility, a certain poverty, a certain lack of energy, a certain set of overwhelming difficulties in which we do find ourselves and against which we are called to stand. But the battle doesn't have to be won today. It simply has to be engaged. And so that being said then, we turn to the handbook itself. There are 3 particular places in the handbook that are important for really understanding the vital power of the role of spiritual director. And the first is found right at the very beginning, the very first sentence of number 2 in the handbook. It's the single most important statement in the handbook. It's the statement of what the point of all of this is. You would think we would lead with that. The object of the Legion of Mary. This is vitally important, and it is amazing how many are unaware of it. But it's why we're doing this. It's where all of this is going. The object of the Legion of Mary is the glory of God through the holiness of its members, developed by prayer and active cooperation under ecclesiastical guidance in Mary's and the Church's work of crushing the head of the serpent and advancing the reign of Christ. That's a mouthful. And yet that one very loaded sentence says an awful, awful lot. It merits rereading. It merits being very familiar with. It merits actually separating out all of the clauses and unpacking them one by one. And we'll do that in a moment. The other 2 statements from the handbook that are important is, in my issue of the handbook, which is probably a couple years older than yours, is on page 165. But it's number 6 in the discussion of the higher councils. And number 6 is again, tucked in the middle of this discussion about administration, is an incredibly strongly worded value statement that, again, is easily missed because of its placement. But it says the strength of the legion rises or falls, the strength of the legion is directly dependent on the quality of its Curia. What an interesting statement. Not the quality of the individual Praesidium, and not the quality of the Senatus, but the quality of the smaller regional council. And it's important to catch that and understand that. There's something vital about that council, that coming together of several Praesidia, that is absolutely essential to the smooth and well-functioning of the Legion. And when we speak of spiritual direction, we can't just talk about Praesidium direction. We have to have an eye toward that if that's so important. And then finally, picking up on what Father McConan said about the formational character of the Legion of Mary. There's a statement in the handbook which says that the spiritual director for his legionaries occupies a role similar to a novice master does in a religious community. Now, we want to be careful with that. Membership in the Legion of Mary is not at all the same thing as belonging to a religious community. And yet there is an insistence that there is a fundamentally formational development about belonging. Not like a canonical novitiate in a religious community which lasts a year or 2 and then the member professes vows. But rather, this is a different kind of formation which is lifelong. It is ongoing formation, an ongoing novitiate in a sense. And the director is that one who kind of oversees this long-term spiritual and moral and personal formation of the members. And again, note the insistence there in a long view, not a short view. And that's vitally important. But all of that is done in the light of and in the context of that very first sentence in chapter number 2 of the handbook. And so let's pause with this for a few moments because it really is worth lingering over. The object, the purpose, the point, the fundamental direction toward which everything in the Legion of Mary runs is this: the glory of God. Well, on the one hand, that's a fairly obvious and safe statement. We're about the glory of God. The question then becomes, though, how do we get there? By what means are we going to give God glory? What is the particular vehicle? If the Legion exists for the glorification of Almighty God, in what particular way does it do so? Because it's not generic. And so it is the glory of God through the holiness of its members. Note, it is not the glory of God through gaining many conversions. It is not the glory of God through the dissemination of much literature. It is not the glory of God through engagement in pastoral initiatives. Exactly. But it involves those things. But first and foremost, the point is God will be glorified by the holiness of the members of the Legion. The next question then is, where does the holiness of the members come from? And that's where all those things I just named fit in. And again, this is vitally important because there are many misunderstandings of the spiritual life. There are a variety of perspectives on how one deepens one's faith, one's prayerfulness. How does one become holy? And the Legion of Mary, as a vehicle for the growth in holiness of its members, says that that growth in holiness will come from two sources. The first one is obvious. It's the one everybody names. Developed by prayer. But prayer is only one of the two vehicles because the Legion of Mary is not and has never been merely a prayer group. And so, but there's an insistence on a certain prayerful character of the members of the Legion. But prayerfulness is not enough and will not produce that particular holiness by which the Legion of Mary will glorify God. So the second piece, active cooperation under ecclesiastical guidance in Mary's and the Church's work of crushing the head of the serpent and advancing the reign of Christ. Active participation in something bigger than ourselves is also required for growth and holiness in the Legion. But note, it is not merely go out and find something good to do. It is active participation, next, under ecclesiastical guidance. That is one of the most vital elements of the spiritual director's role. To guide the active participation of the members, not in self-designated, randomly chosen works, but to guide their participation in Mary's and the Church's work. What an interesting statement that is. What an interesting statement that is. Because the first thing it insists on is that Legion works do not belong to the legionaries. They belong to the Church. And the Legion gets to share that. And the Legion understands itself as something that sits within the Church, participating in the movement of the Church, sharing its mission, sharing its apostolic energy, and working always in harmony with the direction the Church is setting out to move in. Without that ecclesiastical guidance, that drifts very easily. This is why, on many levels, one of the fundamental mistakes that has damaged the Legion, not just in this country but around the world, has been sort of a surrender to the idea that we just randomly choose certain things that are listed in the handbook as Legion works, without a perspective of where do they fit in the parish where we're working, without a sense of how do these things add up together. without a sense of how is this really moving forward the mission of the church where we are. Note the difference. And a good spiritual director will pause at this reality and say, are you telling me that I have 7 or 8, 9 or 10 parishioners who are willing to commit not just to coming out to a weekly meeting, but they're willing to give me 2 hours each on a minimum of apostolic service every single week? And I can't do something with that. You know, what an incredible resource this is. The vision here is that the Legion is something of the fingers of the extended hand of the pastor, the extended hand of the bishop reaching out. Note how beautiful that is. The reach goes further. The impulse is from the church, but somebody has to actually arrive. Someone has to be the point of contact. The Legion at its very best historically has functioned that way. When it becomes merely a group of good people doing good things, it's not that that's horrible. It's that it falls short of what it can be. And so here the idea is that working under the guidance of someone connected to the church, there can be a well-chosen apostolic energy and initiative, well-focused, that can add something or bring something that wasn't necessarily there before. What a powerful idea that is. And note that this participation in the work has this double character of crushing the head of the serpent. In other words, opposing in some way that which is wrong, sinful, and destructive. But also extending the reign of Christ. It is also involving something that is upbuilding. It's the turn away from sin and believe in the gospel that we see in the original preaching of Jesus. The renunciation of Satan and the belief in God that we have in the vows of baptism. But note how beautiful that is, though, but it is not we pick and we run in a direction. The desire is that this be well-guided, well-directed, well-focused, and creatively exercised. And so again, it's exalted language, but within the humbler, more fragile context in which we find ourselves, it can also be an impetus for some forward movement. You know, a handful of people with energy can't do everything, but they can do something. What a marvelous, marvelous idea that is. And it's out of this, then, that the framework of the Legion, the complexity of its rules, the different levels of its structure emerge. And the first is this. The Legion of Mary, a Legion of Mary Praesidium, is on the one hand, for example, when a Praesidium is located in a parish, it's kind of like the Knights of Columbus. On the one hand, that's a parish group. And yet on another hand, it's something different. Because that Praesidium is also connected to all of the other Praesidia. And it's this double character of its structure that also helps to give the Legion its peculiar power when we understand it well. And so again, I want to stress this. When I say on the one hand, it's not, that doesn't mean it's disconnected from the pastor or the parish. It simply means it has a dimension that reaches out beyond the parish. And so the Legion recognizes that for its own health and well-being, these smaller units, the local Praesidiae, must with some regularity come together. And why would that be the case? Well, on a practical level for working together, but in the handbook, there is no mechanism for training officers. In the handbook, there is no mechanism for the formation of a spiritual director. Nothing like that is spelled out in detail. Rather, the Curia meeting is where officers come together and learn how to run a meeting well. Where they come together and newer officers can learn from more experienced officers how to do their jobs. Secondly, one of the officers who is welcome to attend a Curia meeting is the Praesidium spiritual director. It can also become the setting where spiritual directors get together and talk about issues or questions that are coming up, because they often come up in multiple locations at the same time. The fundamental point is that coordinated interaction and planning and sharing of information that allows the Legion to move forward. The reporting is a necessary and vital part of that, but is not the essence of it. And that's the issue, because these moments then where multiple Praesidiae come together, one can see that if there is a spiritual director of limited availability, even an occasional appearance at a Curia meeting can make a large difference, because there are going to be the officers of several Praesidiae in attendance. It's a chance to renew, to encourage, to provide some formation to a larger group out of the experience of working with my local group. And, you know, one of the realities for clergy in particular today, especially for guys who are working in parishes, it's not that we have a dozen assistants anymore. It's not the old days. It's not that there aren't more and more things put on our plate today, because there are. And so time becomes one of those precious commodities that we learn to be very careful with before we offer it, before we extend it. So let's talk about that for a moment. The basic commitment of the active Legion members is the weekly meeting plus 2 hours of apostolic work. The handbook, however, is very clear when it says it is not essential that the spiritual director attend every meeting. What an interesting statement that is. And again, a statement that was written back when there were many more clergy available to do these things than there are today. And why? Because it always recognized the demands on the priest's time. But it also stressed, but it is important to find some time to be present to the Praesidium. And it is important to regularly receive information from the Praesidium president. That could be as simple as an email after the meeting, basically, if any questions came up. But the idea being to keep contact with some regularity and some consistency, punctuated by moments of attendance when we can be physically present. One of the ways the Legion has really struggled over the years is in a sense that when the spiritual director is absent, he's become completely absent. No, very little communication back and forth. And so, again, this doesn't require a lot of effort, but it does require a certain amount of attentiveness. That communication tends to increase the more a Praesidium is effectively extending the ministries of the parish. The more, and we all know this, the more something begins to work, the more there's forward movement in a direction, the more we pay attention. The more we want to be careful and conscious of directing it. And so again, on the level of good direction for the Legion, well-chosen works are also going to be something the pastor himself takes an interest in. Because if he's interested in the project that the Legion is undertaking, he's going to be interested in the Praesidium. And it also begs the question of, if I have all of this energy among my faithful, why would I put them in a direction that I'm not interested in? I would rather leverage them in a direction that can move something forward for all of us. So a very, very simple point, but one that is easily missed, easily overlooked. A structure like this can really fall into the trap of merely going through the motions. The meeting is well run, works are being done, but somehow it doesn't add up to much. And in part it can be because in a Praesidium of 10 members, there are 5 or 6 different works that are being done. And so nothing adds up, nothing gets momentum. It could be that the legionaries are dissipated doing the work that other groups in the parish likewise are already doing. And so again, the legion adds nothing distinctive to the parish. It doesn't extend the pastor's reach. It just puts a different character into that touch. But when the Praesidium can be well focused with its works under the guidance of a good director, it can learn to do new things, and it can produce a real benefit locally. That being said, one additional reason why this is so important is there are places in the handbook where we are reminded that that heavier, aggressive, exalted language is not there by accident and is not merely rhetorical flourish. For example, there are repeated calls to a certain degree of heroism on the part of the legion. It's not a universal call to heroism, but it is an insistence that there must be a certain apostolic boldness to be found somewhere when the legion is present. That in a diocese or a region, there are 1 or 2 presidia who commit themselves to doing something bolder, to not simply repeating the laundry list of things that have already been done. Whether that's working in an area that is more dangerous, whether that is working with a population that is more difficult, whether it's undertaking a pastoral initiative that is simply more demanding, that requires more than 2 hours a week. And it's marvelous that this gets built right into the system of the Legion. Not that every Praesidium needs to extend itself and risk overextending itself, but there must be some capacity within the Legion somewhere for an increased extension, an increased step of risk. And that old dictum that if we take no risks for the Lord, we'll never do anything good for him, never do anything great for him, and that preaching the gospel does sooner or later require a step forward with a bit of risk. And again, this becomes very important both on the local but most especially on the regional level for the Legion. Having officers that are willing to ask that question, is there something different we can do? Having a director who is capable of guiding that and helping to discern what might be the appropriate movement to make. But then the thing that comes with that, though, is imagine the energy around those reports when they're given at the meetings. How when there's a sense of we're moving forward with something new or something challenging, when we're stepping into an obstacle and not simply surrendering, that's a vigor that then gets shared across the other groups of the Legion, and everybody gets strengthened when there are a handful who seek to reach forward. No, but moving the Legion forward is not and has never been a matter of reorienting the entire structure all at once. It begins in those humble local realities where we find ourselves. One Praesidium at a time, one Curia at a time, one group of legionaries at a time. When they're well guided, well directed, well supported, good and even great things do happen. And when one begins to move rightly, it's amazing how quickly 2 or 3 others begin to fall in step. But if we try and reorient everything all at once, everybody usually ends up struggling and frustrated, and we take 3 steps back rather than moving forward at all. I say all of this because obviously from those first initial contacts I made with the Legion, I found it worth learning more and involving myself more regularly. in Arabia, and I've worked and preached in Oman, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. It is remarkable to see the way so much of the church is held together by the Legion of Mary. Some of the parishes have 200,000 parishioners. They might have 40 Praesidium just in the parish. And they're the ones who are with their hidden statues of Mary because the public display of Christian symbols is prohibited, taking hours riding buses on their one day off to do a pilgrim image visitation to an externed maid who isn't allowed to leave that family's home. Absolutely remarkable, just the energy and the movement, and how with congregations that large, again, the priests are limited in terms of how many people they can meet and what they can do, especially when you're saying multiple masses every single day in several languages. And so it's a group like the Legion that, with simple faithfulness to basic works, but a heroic generosity of giving of time, is doing remarkable work, just keeping these disparate communities together and functioning. They're the ones that are finding the children that they bring to the catechism classes. The Legion doesn't do the catechism, but it puts the children in the seats. An absolutely remarkable work. It's one of the more heroic things I've seen. And again, in a setting where everything is difficult. Culturally, societally, from the government on down, everything works against the outward expression of the faith. And yet here are these thousands of legionaries faithfully moving forward with this. And again, it's a real credit to the 2 or 3 priests who have really involved themselves in being their directors. It's not enough priests for so many Praesidia, but it's enough guys to make a difference. And again, it was a number of the clergy who helped them discern the right way to do these works. Because the handbook doesn't tell you, how do I do a pilgrim image visitation program in a country that doesn't allow the open outward expression of the faith? And so somebody has to ask that question and help figure out how that works. You know, that's really beautiful because, again, when one does these things, it's not merely a matter of making sure good work gets done. It's not simply a matter of making sure that the faith gets taught. This is also how the members of the Legion acquire that growth in holiness that is the very object of their membership. It's not merely service. It's service as an expression of and a movement into deeper holiness. And without a reliable guide on the part of the church for that, that quickly gets lost and we lose ourselves in a narrow utility, a narrow practicality. The beautiful thing about all of this is that intimate connection of the works to the holiness of the members. This is why at every single Legion meeting, after the reporting of the works, the catena is said. Why? It's the great prayer of thanksgiving for the grace of a visit. One of the most important roles of the director when he is present at the meeting is to lead the prayers. And that is not a small thing to do. It is something that the director should not surrender. When the director is present, he should lead the prayers. Because this is also where we form our members in how to pray well. Because again, that's not something that people naturally or easily pick up on their own. We form our members in how to pray the rosary well, how to stand and pray the catena well. And that remarkable thing is the Legion meeting begins with the Praesidium on its knees, and it ends with the Praesidium on its knees. And everything that happens in the meeting is contained between those two moments on our knees. And the director kneels with the Praesidium, and on his knees prays with the Praesidium. The director kneels with the Praesidium at the end, and then rises from his knees to bless the members before they rise and go forth themselves. And all of the business, all of the planning, all of the reporting is contained within that. And the beautiful thing then of the allocutio that the director gives, which should focus on some aspect of Legion life. It doesn't have to come from the handbook, but it should in some way relate to the life and the mission of the Legion. The interesting thing is, it's part of that movement of praying the catena. We stand for the catena, and then we sit for the allocutio. It's part of that same prayerful moment. It's not merely a teaching, it's a spiritual reflection, a spiritual exhortation. And it's only after the catena, after the allocutio is concluded, that we make the sign of the cross and go back to other business. And note just that beautiful brief point of interjection. A reflection on a single virtue, reflection on a single aspect of Legion life. It doesn't have to be very long, but it should be focused and solid and something that the members can profit from in terms of how they pray and how they participate in the work of the church. And if that happens even occasionally, that's a great gift for a Praesidium. A great gift. And I think they're flagging me down to wind up. Okay, in that case, I'm done.
Father, could you lead us in grace?
Could I lead you in grace? Yes, I could. By the powerful intercession of the Holy Virgin Mary, we ask you, great God, to bless with your blessing, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, this meal that we are about to receive and the fellowship that gathers in this place. And we ask that as this food nourish and strengthen our bodies, so may your grace enliven and quicken our hearts for your service. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.